Okay, so if we're going to have a reflex, we need to have a detector, we need to have a form of intelligence of some kind, and then we need a response, right? Well, the detection system includes a variety of different receptors in the autonomic nervous system. So this is one type. Baroreceptors detect pressure. When pressure increases, the cells in these areas increase their action potential firing rate. So that sends a signal to the brain or to the autonomic ganglia that pressure has increased. So where do we have these baroreceptors, pressure receptors? Well, in terms of blood pressure management, we have the carotid sinus and the aortic sinus. These are both areas in those vessels, in the carotid and aortic. A sinus is just an opening or an empty area. So we have these little tiny sinuses, little empty spots in the carotid artery and in the aorta that have cells in them that detect blood pressure. When blood pressure goes up, they fire faster. When blood pressure goes down, they fire slower. So that becomes our detector for blood pressure. Critical because the autonomic nervous system is our primary regulator of blood pressure, right? And cardiac output both. Okay, so that's one category, blood pressure sensors. Respiratory sensors. In the lungs, we have baroreceptors that provide information to the brainstem about how completely lungs are filling and emptying, right? So in other words, if you take a great big breath, you're going to increase the pressure in your thorax. Well, the baroreceptors are going to detect that. They're going to send that information to the brain. So one of the things that these do is they protect us from damaging our own lungs. So it doesn't matter how hard you breathe, you're never going to pop your own lung, at least not if your lungs are healthy, because of these baroreceptors, right? These receptors also help the brain to coordinate respiration, right? We do a lot of things with our respiratory tract, like talking, like I'm doing right now. So it takes a fair bit of coordinating breathing with the other things we do, talking, playing an instrument, blowing up a balloon, swimming, scuba diving, snorkeling. All of those things require the brain to interact with the lungs in complex ways. All right. The bladder wall. The bladder is constantly filling with fluid, right? Constantly filling with urine through the ureters from the kidneys. When the bladder gets full enough, it begins to contract. That's that sensation of needing to urinate. So that process is all detected by baroreceptors in the wall of the bladder. We have similar receptors, smooth muscle baroreceptors, in the digestive tract and the colon as well. In the digestive tract, it helps to move material along, keep things mixed up, and keep the digestive enzymes working. And then in the colon, of course, that's where we also have the defecation reflex is detected by baroreceptors. So a very simple kind of receptor type, but its usefulness in the body is pretty broad, pretty important. All right, so that's pressure. Another thing we need to be able to detect is chemistry, right? So we have chemoreceptors in key parts of the body that detect our critical chemistries, particularly pH, CO2, and oxygen. Now, we have a lot of other chemistries that need to be correct in order for our physiology to work right, okay? But these things are necessary to be pretty in normal, if pH, CO2, and oxygen aren't normal, there's not really much of hope for anything else, right? So the body pays particular real-time constant attention to these pivotal molecules, right? So in the medulla oblongata, we have cells that are very sensitive to changes in pH and carbon dioxide level. One of the things that we're going to go over at length in the respiratory tract is that we humans, we don't breathe because we need oxygen. That isn't our drive to breathe. We breathe because we have to get rid of CO2, right? There's actually way more oxygen in the air than we need there to be. So we don't have to breathe to get oxygen in, we have to breathe to get CO2 out. And that's what this part of the brain is concerned with, is setting your respiratory rate so that your CO2 level matches your production rate, right? Okay, so that's medulla oblongata. We're going to talk specifically about that area in the respiratory system. We also have chemoreceptors in the carotid and aortic bodies. Okay, same place that we have the baroreceptors. So while these areas are measuring pressure, they are also measuring CO2, oxygen, and pH as well. Now, why does that make sense? Because ultimately, our cardiovascular function is going to determine what our CO2, oxygen, and pH level is. If we're not circulating enough blood around, we're going to tend to become acidotic, our oxygen's going to drop, and our CO2 is going to go up, right? Not because their lungs aren't working right, but because we aren't moving blood around fast enough or completely enough. So these chemoreceptors play a role in the cardiovascular system's management of CO2, oxygen, and pH. So all of these we're going to talk about at length when we get into our regulation of the cardiovascular system, right? Both neural regulation as well as hormonal regulation. So chemoreceptors and baroreceptors, those are the two main detectors of the autonomic nervous system.